So I don't think it's a surprise to any of us that interconnectivity versus isolation seems to be a theme the past few years. I mean, I hope that clicks right away. But, with the pandemic, I think it's ironic that we were forced into isolation at the very moment where it couldn't have been clearer that we're all interconnected, right? Because a tiny little virus demonstrated how very interconnected we are. So, of course, it's been a theme, I think, for everyone the past few years. But I'll start by telling a little anecdote. I had a dream, and I often have dreams in which I literally feel like I was visited by maybe somebody I haven't seen in a while, or even people who have passed. And it's just so vivid, and I wake as if I just visited that person. And in this case, and a lot of cases, there's a fondness there. So I wake with just a real feeling of fondness and attachment. And I have this theory that, sometimes we don't allow ourselves, in the same way that we keep negative feelings at bay, we keep fondness and sentimentality at bay sometimes. Maybe, I don't know, out of fear, we don't want to take risks with our heart, or just because daily life is so demanding that we don't get in touch with our connections and our attachments and our fondness. And affinity is a good word, I guess. So anyway, sometimes if I feel like I've just really had a great visit with somebody's soul on some other plane, I awake feeling really connected to that person. And so I had one such dream in which a former student, actually, whom I just adore and admire, and embodies, I guess, a lot of qualities that I aspire to, that I hope to share with this person. And we're like-minded, we're kindred spirits. There's a lot there, but just love the guy, put it that way. I didn't want to make this long, but anyway, in the dream, this person had descended into homelessness and mental illness. And I've actually seen that happen to several people in my neighborhood over the course of time. I've watched it, I've witnessed it. And in this case, it was somebody that I loved who ostensibly on paper had everything. Literally, probably the best looking person I know, beautiful wife, beautiful children, white picket fence, beautiful home, amazing career, just what we would call together, very together. So in the dream, it was very disillusioning to see how quickly things can go south. And so, of course, there's a theme there of just the fragility or the tenuous nature of life, and especially the material, right? And so I'm sure I was crying in my sleep, actually, and I certainly was crying in the dream, but then it transitioned into a phone call from my mother, who's currently in home hospice and not quite all there, and then her mother, who passed a few years ago, my grandmother, who would probably be, I think, 99 or 100 this year. And anyway, in the dream, my mom called, and I was relaying to her what my former student had descended into and what I had literally just experienced, because I was probably on the verge of tears when my mom called. And then on the other line was my grandmother. And it was kind of a non-issue in the dream that my mom was coherent, or that my grandmother was seemingly alive and on the other line. None of it was strange in the dream. But anyway, then of course I awoke feeling that I had just had a visit from my grandmother from the other side, and from my mother, who may or may not, depending on the day, be very present. So all I felt was connection and attachment, and it just reminded me, there's a lot of thematic content there, but even without analyzing the different themes, I felt like, the takeaway here was, wow, I really can feel deep fondness and affection for people. Lately, especially with the pandemic, and I'm sure everyone will relate, I feel for my dog. I love my dog, and it kind of ends right there. I theoretically love my family and friends, but I don't feel it on a day-to-day basis. There's no opportunity to feel the depth of the affection. So I love my dog, and I never wanted to be this guy, but I kind of am in the place of dogs are superior to humans, and never wanted to be that guy, but I'm working on it. I'm working on feeling my affection and having more gratitude all day, every day. But the dream was a wonderful reminder that I do feel things for people, not just dogs. And it just felt like a visit from my grandmother and my mom, who are, arguably on another plane. Anyway, and then when I related to my sister, she reminded me that just like in a novel, every character in a dream can be seen as an aspect of one's psyche. So a lot of dream analysis comes from that standpoint. If everyone in the dream represents some aspect of you, what could it mean? So when I analyze dreams for friends, which I've done, I think all of the above are applicable. You can use Jungian archetypes. You can look for personal, subjective symbology that's not universal or archetypal. I think there's a lot of ways to analyze dreams, and the idea of seeing every character as some aspect of your psyche is just one of them. Same with literature. It's very valuable. But in this case, I just had this knee-jerk reaction like, oh no, I mean, it just felt like it was all about anything but me. It didn't feel egocentric. And so it just led me to a few thoughts over the course of the last couple days because of what I'm reading currently, which is The Biology of Belief by Bruce Lipton, and just what I'm immersed in right now. Interconnectivity. So I thought, well, this idea that everything's egocentric, it kind of reminded me of the thought that, well, nothing we do is truly altruistic. It's always self-serving, which I despise. Even when you are generous with somebody, you're always looking for the return. And I just don't buy that. So, I don't know, it connected with the idea that altruism does exist for a reason. It serves the tribe, it serves the propagation of the species. So by definition, it's self-sacrificing and not self-serving. So when I was faced with the possibility that my dream was completely egocentric and was about everything but interconnectivity, I had a knee-jerk reaction and I sort of dug my heels in, mentally at least. I didn't say anything to my sister because it only occurred to me later. So then what clicked is, what I was made aware of in reading The Biology of Belief, which is the Darwinian viewpoint that's really taken hold in the scientific community, that survival of the fittest is behind any and all of our evolution. It may or may not be the objective truth here. Lamarckian, which I guess Lamarck was really dismissed in his time, but he's sort of gaining validity and relevance now, 100 years later. The Lamarckian idea was that there is symbiosis, that all organisms are actually in cooperation for the proliferation of life in general and for consciousness, in my world, for consciousness in general. I think there's a lot of evidence of that, and epigenetics is confirming that the adaptive mutations, not just the random mutations, the adaptive mutations based on environment are for the greater good of all life forms and not just one particular species. So I hope a little bit of that made sense, but it's been coming up so much lately, I thought it was worth saying. I think we need to swap out our lens collectively and look for anything but survival of the fittest around us. We need to look for altruism and symbiosis and interconnectivity. We need to stop seeing our dreams as being completely self-serving and stop seeing all acts of generosity as self-serving on some level. They may not be. Altruism is alive and well. I just think survival of the fittest as a sort of overarching philosophy we don't even question it. And that's, I think, what we need to revisit, meaning even, books that claim to be visionary fiction like Celestine Prophecy, they talk about how, from the quantum level all the way up, every life form is literally, kill or be killed. Well, there's also adapt or die. There's a lot of kind of principles that coexist, but we don't question them and we don't examine them. So I think when you start looking at, entanglement throughout the universe of all particles, if you start looking at, non-local communication between not just neighboring cells, but cells within an organism, in a tribe, in a species, intraspecies communication, it's all happening through environmental energetic impulses, right, that penetrate the gates and channels in the cell wall. But a lot of it's energetic. So could be argued again that the methyl groups that result from that and the adaptive mutations are for the greater good of all, and that all life forms are symbiotic and are in cooperation for the proliferation of life in general. Hope that makes sense. But I wanted to say in particular that, I even acknowledge that Brian in the dream embodied a lot of the qualities I aspire to, and perhaps a lot of those qualities with which I identify. So of course, even in the conversation with my sister, I said, yeah, if I make Brian some aspect of myself, then truly it's about self-love, right? The love that I felt was self-love, which is something I've absolutely been working on, the ability to love myself despite tools that I wasn't given. So it's all good and all analyses are valid. But I guess what that says to me is it's a choice how to view the universe. The universe is a Rorschach test. We can swap out our lens. And in life, we can choose to see everything as survival of the fittest. But the question becomes, what is the benefit of that? I think it was Einstein himself that said, it's a choice to view the universe as benevolent or not, something like that. So I think everything is subjective. I mean, what we perceive and then reify with our brains, it only happens in our noodle, in our noggin, right? Those waves don't even fix as particles without an observer. So we do create our own reality and project it on that movie screen, right, of life. So I think it's just more helpful to view things as symbiotic or altruistic at best. I mean, I think there's a reason that the idea of serving is a tenet, a spiritual tenet that many aspire to, right? Self-serving acts are a dead-end road, are folly in some traditions. And there's this idea that only when we connect with purpose and contribute to the collective by serving are we content. There's a reason for that. A parallel that occurs to me is that the more Darwinian mindset of survival of the fittest, serves our ego. Whereas most spiritual or wisdom traditions seek to extract the ego, right, and sort of speak to our core essence, which, arguably is love. And that's where the altruism and the interconnectivity and the symbiosis derives. There's nothing wrong with the ego because it is also something that evolved along with our biology for a very good reason, right? If we're assessing threats and opportunities all day, every day, sort of mapping the highly emotional, physiologically that is, the highly emotional experiences on the worldview, it's so that we'll have a database to refer to later when we encounter similar scenarios. So the ego is very much there for our survival. It is not to be demonized, but for the record, most spiritual traditions seek to, right, extract that or quiet the chatter of the ego to speak to our core essence. And I would say that core essence sees the world through the eyes of love, not competition, but cooperation.